We have a great group joining us today, number of old friends, and thank you very much all for coming. And thank you, Carol and Lisa, for participating in Russian Literature Week this year, different from Russian Literature Week in other years. This year, because of the pandemic, we are forced to do an experiment, which is to have all of these events online. Some of them are pre-recorded. You'll see them all at Read Russia's website. And so far, I'm just going to say, don't let me jinx this event today, but so far, these have been wonderful. We don't have the zakuski, we don't have the vodka, I mean, at least communally. Yet we have great conversations and dialogues. And it seems like we should be doing this more often, especially in the winter, as it stretches on. You'll decide. This group will decide, help us decide whether to sponsor more of these. This is Russian Literature Week, the third day of 5. And this event, like many of the things we do, is brought to you thanks to the Institute of Translation in Moscow, to whom we are grateful. And let me introduce our speakers today. And if anybody needs anything special, please put it in any requests or anything of a technical nature, please put that in the chat as well. Carol Apollonio is the author, editor, and translator of books and articles about 19th century Russian literature, including simply Chekhov, Chekhov's Letters, and Dostoyevsky's Secrets. Her translations include novels by Alisa Ganyeva and German Sadulayev from the Russian, 2 books by Kizaki Satoko from the Japanese. She holds a sesquicentennial Chekhov Medal from the Russian Ministry of Culture and serves as president of the International Dostoyevsky Society. And in the fall of 2019, she traveled across Siberia in quest of classic Russian writers, chronicling her adventures in her blog, Chekhov's Footprints. And Carol has given us, with Lisa, I believe, maybe co-authored the title of this event today, which serves pretty much as the theme for Russian Literature Week this year, reading Russian literature during difficult times. Lisa Hayden, with us from Maine, her translations from the Russian include Evgeny Vodolazkin's Laurus, which won the 2016 Read Russia Prize for Contemporary Russian Literature, and was shortlisted for the 2016 Oxford-Weidenfeld Translation Prize, as well as Vodolazkin's The Aviator and Solovyov and Larionov. She also translated Vadim Levental's Masha, Regina, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Oxford-Weidenfeld Award, Guzel Yakhina's Zuleikha, a finalist for the 2020 EBRD Literature Prize, Read Russia Prize, and National Translation Award, and Margarita Khemlin's Klotsvog for the Russian Library, a project that Read Russia has a hand in supporting at Columbia University Press. Lisa's blog, Lizok's bookshelf, focuses, which is an extraordinary resource, focuses on contemporary Russian fiction. And she is also a member of the Literary Academy, the jury for Russia's Big Book Award, probably because she's the closest of all of us to the continent in the States, you know, in Maine. People are joining from all around. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. Other guests may join us throughout the program today, but Carol, Lisa, please take it away.
Oh, well, it's very exciting to be here with Lisa, who's one of my favorite and actually most respected people. So the pressure is on. We were wondering if there were going to be any questions. And so it looks as though we're going to just have a good conversation, right, Lisa?
Sure. Yeah, we usually do this in a donut shop.
Right.
Carol and I mean, in a normal year, and of course this is not by any stretch of the imagination, a normal year, Carol and I usually see each other, I don't know, at least once or twice, sometimes even more frequently. And some of our best conversations have been, well, they're almost always at meals. And some of the best conversations have been at a donut shop, which is on her way to visit her brother. It's in my town, and it's on her way to visit her brother. And so we end up talking about Russian literature and translation. And actually, Carol, maybe we can start, we can segue, because the second donut shop visit, I remember you saying, we were talking about Laurus and translation and what a good book that is. And you said something like, masterpieces are rare. And I think we were kind of indicating that we thought that that book is a masterpiece, that Vodolazkin's book is a contemporary masterpiece. And so I would like to ask you this. We prepared some questions that we could have as backup in case we needed them, but you know, it just occurs to me that I'd like to ask you what you think about reading masterpieces in pandemic times. I know you've read a couple of them, but let's start with that and look at how quality and literary, you know, the literary canon might fit into our reading at times like this.
Oh, wow. See, one thing, Lisa and I did exchange some emails, and we said, we're going to ask each other questions, but we're not going to tell each other what those questions are. So we really are on the edge here. And you've mentioned several things that I think we could talk the whole time about. That is Laurus, the Holy Donut, which is the name of this special, very special coffee shop. And the fact that Laurus is a masterpiece, and it's about a plague, which is highly convenient, is relevant to me. And then at the same time, you're mentioning masterpieces, which reminded me that I spent this fall with a number of 40 students at Duke reading Tolstoy and Dostoyevsky. That's what I spent my fall doing. And it struck me as important and interesting, and maybe a sign of the times, that people really are choosing to read these books. I mean, whether they're a masterpiece or not, I guess each person gets to decide. It does help that a lot of people think that Tolstoy and Dostoevsky wrote masterpieces, and then we go in there and we read them and you think, oh yeah, this is really good. You know, this touches me where it counts. So one thing that happened after one of my classes, at the end of the semester, a student she popped in the office, and of course we're all having our masks on, don't get me wrong. So there was no inappropriate contact, but she came in and she said, you know, I tried to read another book after Anna Karenina, and I couldn't get through it because it was no good. That nothing is any good after Tolstoy. So there's a bit of repair work to do. I mean, we could say, okay, you read all of Tolstoy and then you can read some other stuff, but there are going to be 120 volumes in the new Tolstoy. And that's a lot of reading. It could really take your whole life. So when you're stuck, stop me when I talk too much, Lisa, because I know that there are very many exciting things I want to hear you talking about. But when we're confined, as we have been this fall, or actually all year, almost, this is terrifying to think, right? It's almost been a year. You know, it was the craziest thing that we were reading. I had scheduled Laurus to read with my students last year. And I'm curled up on my sofa at home reading this book about the plague, knowing that we're not going to have students back to read with us in person because of a plague, you know. So there is a kind of relevance to literature that we don't necessarily think about when we think about literature as an escape. And that got me thinking about two completely ways of reading literature when we're stuck and confined as we are. One is, I would call it leaning in, where you go, okay, this book is going to help me understand something about what we're going through right now. So Laurus, we could say it's about a plague. And by reading it, I can learn something about what it means to be sick, you know? So it's leaning into the text, right? But then there's a completely different way of reading literature. And oh, by the way, my example for that would be this very famous epilogue from Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov, the murderer, is serving time in Siberia. And I was going to read this, but we may not want to read to each other. But it was a book, it was an excerpt I had planned to read out loud, where Raskolnikov dreams about a destructive journal. Well, you know what? I'll just read it, Lisa.
Read it.
And Peter, you can do us a favor of making sure we get exactly to the second, the same amount of time to talk, okay? So I could be using it up right now. Raskolnikov is in the hospital. He spent the whole of last period of Lent and Easter Sunday laid up in hospital. In his sickness, he imagined the entire world condemned to some terrible unheard of pestilence, advancing on Europe from deepest Asia. Everyone was to die, apart from the few, very few who'd been chosen. New trichina had appeared, microscopic beings that were entering human bodies. But these beings were spirits, endowed with intelligence and will. People who took them into their bodies immediately became possessed and went mad. But never had people thought themselves as intelligent and as certain of the truth as those who had been infected. And I want to put a shout out, if anybody wants to pursue that, quote more, you should Google the bloggers Karamazov, the blog for the Brothers Karamazov, for the the North American Dostoyevsky Society, the really wonderful post by Irina Ehrman there about illness and metaphor in Crime and Punishment. It's a really wonderful short blog post to talk about that. But for me, that reminded me about leaning in, saying, okay, we're in illness now, let's think about illness and read about it. And there's another kind of reading that involves like, I don't want to read about illness at all. I want to totally get out of the world that is fraught with illness and escape. And for that, I have a lot of Tolstoy. But I think that's enough for me right now, Lisa.
Well, just to pick up on your illness, about how some people read about illness and others avoid it. Maybe you mentioned that because I mentioned last week when we were talking about reading Turgenev. I had a really hard time finding books to read when things shut down in mid March, and I was totally flailing to find a book that I could read, and I finally settled on Andrew Miller's Pure, which is it's a contemporary book about some centuries ago, and it was weird, and I think that was what I liked. It wasn't a sort of realistic historical novel. It was kind of a weird historical novel. And things just kept going like that. I kept reading weird things, and I read Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. Is that right? It doesn't sound like the right pronunciation, but it is. Annihilation, thank you, trilogy. And I still keep reading a lot of science fiction. But then I read, I don't want to say I made the mistake of reading Turgenev's On the Eve, where there's a character who gets sick. And remember what he had, and I don't know if it was even stated in the book, but I kept writing sounds like COVID in the margins, because it did. And I vowed to not read another illness book after that. If I can sort of switch over to another part of things that I was thinking about, I think the sort of the forced shutdown of things and has also enforced kind of a slowdown to a lot of things. Including how we observe the world. And I have all sorts of evidence of that in translations and in my own reading. But that seems to be a sort of, for me anyway, that seems to be kind of a unifying theme in my reading and in my translation practice as well. And it's something that I find very consoling. And to pick up on the consolation theme, that was kind of my original title for this event, but then Carol took it broader with the hard times, which I really appreciated, because this is about a lot more than just consolation. I remember just finally yesterday that the last time I was really out in public, other than just going grocery shopping or having coffee, was at Bowdoin College when I gave a talk about translation. And I'm going to just read one paragraph from that talk, because this kind of sums up how I'm feeling now about translation, about my books, and about authors, and about what reading does for me. I suspect the most important personal aspect of my feeling about my books and authors is that even when they are relentlessly dark, they bring various forms of consolation. I find the act of reading consoling because it enables me to peer into other lives and places. Perhaps this is related to the empathy effect that some researchers claim to find among readers of fiction. As a reading and writing professional, the very fact of the existence of absorbing coherent books that offer intellectual stimulation. My favorite books, the ones that offer the most consolation, simultaneously teach me both how to read them and how to read and see life itself. There's probably another connection there too, though that's another topic I prefer to leave untouched. And I talked earlier in this about how there are certain things that I don't like to know about a book or about an author or why a book reads the way it does. I like to have a certain element of mystery to things. So that's kind of how I see the elements of consolation. It's something that goes beyond just a sort of emotional effect. It's also an intellectual effect. And to quote, if I can find the right little, Language Hat, another blogger, he wrote about Solovyov's book, The Petty Demon, and he wrote in his post, good writing is never depressing. And I kind of wonder if that's part of why we find these classics or, you know, contemporary masterpieces that we hope / think will become classics to be so consoling, even when they have so many dark elements, as Laurus does and as Three Apples Fell from the Sky also does.
Carol, given the task you've given me, you have 3 minutes now to even out things.
No, she has more.
Oh, good. Oh, I appreciate
it.
Yeah, we need to be kept in order, which I appreciate that a lot. So about consolation, I mean, when we first talked about maybe having a session about how literature can console us, I felt very sort of anxious about that because it struck me that you can read literature, what I call indicatively. That is, you read a story and you look for a story that's happy, you know, and then you're like, since you read a happy story, it makes you happy. And that was something that I find really sort of repellent and primitive, because the consolation of literature actually, to me, involves going as deep as you can go into being a human being, you know, into your soul, into your mind. It touches all parts of yourself, you know, your emotions, your brain, your ethical self, your psychology, all the weirdness that we carry inside us that others don't see, and that we don't see the weirdness inside other people and the dysfunction inside other people out in the world. But in literature we do. And this was discussed this morning. I enjoyed that session this morning with Gary Saul Morrison and Morton Shapiro, talking about how literature really, this is not just words about empathy. You know, you get into someone else's mind and you experience the world in a way that would have felt dark if you were experiencing it all by yourself. But if you get inside, let's say, Raskolnikov's mind, Raskolnikov being the murderer, and you get to murder the old ladies with Raskolnikov, you're actually inside his brain. And then you somehow manage to close the book afterwards and come out of it and go, oh my God, thank God I didn't actually murder someone. You know, there's something really pretty uplifting about that, where you go, okay, I've been harboring this darkness that I'm afraid to look at, you know, and I'm thinking, well, there's an axe, you know, over there in the corner, and I could just go get that axe. And I don't mean to scare everybody. I see there's people here. I don't want you to, you know, get any crazy ideas, but you read literature and it takes you there, those places you're denying, you know, yourself the ability to contemplate. And you work through it somehow. And I don't want to get primitive and psychological or therapeutic or whatever, but that stuff feels real if it's well written. So you started out by asking about masterpieces. Masterpieces feel real, even if they're sort of fantasy based, you know, even if they're, I know that Three Apples, which I read over the weekend, a beautiful book that Lisa translated, Abgaryan is the author's name. Beautiful book that has these little glimpses of the not fantastic, but a world that we don't normally see, or we have messengers from another planet who just appear in the mundane reality and then disappear. There's something about the way that we read about another person's fate or another person's universe very different from ours that allows little glimpses of hope somehow. And again, I don't want that to be primitive. I like the dark stuff, but I think that that's a preconception people have about Russian literature. Well, all right, it's true, guys. It's dark, you know, it's dark stuff. But we read it and then we keep going back to it because it's real. If it's well written, you know, if it's not primitive. I don't know if that was getting anywhere, Lisa.
It does. Well, yeah, yes, what you just said is very similar to what what I read from the Bowden talk, I think, because it's not just that you feel good at the end. I mean, Three Apples, it's really funny. I'll interrupt myself here. Here's the cover, and you can see this blurb here from Ulitskaya. I joined, here's another thing that I did during the pandemic. After I was invited to speak to a book club in London about my translation of Zuleikha, they invited me to come back. I really enjoyed talking with them. And these are people who translate and have been meeting in this book club to read mostly translations for, I don't know, some years now. And so I've been going back almost every month pretty much since the pandemic started. So there's a woman in the group who reads a lot of Russian literature. She studied Russian literature and she reads it in Russian, but she also reads translations. And so toward the end of the meeting, she said, Lisa, and she held up this book and she pointed at this and she said, is this true? Because she was looking for a happier book. We just read an adaptation of a stage adaptation of the Canterbury Tales, which entertained everybody quite a bit. And she was looking, but she was looking for Russian literature that would have something that wasn't utterly dark. And I said, and I think this pretty much sums up most of the books that I've translated. I said, there's a lot of really dark stuff in this book. I mean, there's some horrible abuse. There's a lot of horrible abuse. There's illness. There are all sorts of weird pestilent insects and rodents and there's all sorts of problems, illnesses, unexplained, all kinds of terrible things happen. But yet, it has a pretty hopeful ending, and it doesn't feel saccharine. It doesn't feel treacly. It's a good book. It's a very good book. And actually, Carol, read that little bit. And I'm going to try not to cry because this particular paragraph always gets me. But this is what I'm talking about with slowing down and paying attention to what's around you. And this book really gets at that. And this is just, I think it's just one paragraph that I'm going to read here. It's right almost exactly in the middle of the book, you can see. And I won't explain who the characters are because it'll make sense anyway. They ate lunch in silence and tranquility. They spoke little and only of distant things. And there was so much that was offhand and ordinary in the clinking of spoons, the request to pass the salt and slice a piece of cheese, or in a swallow of water, and the slightly dry heel of the homemade bread, that Anatolia sensed for the first time that life was a gift, not something to take for granted. She shifted her gaze subtly from Yaseman to Avanes and then to Vasily, catching his measured, unhurried gestures and mentally agreeing with them, feeling surprised that she had never noticed this unconditional connection between herself and everything around her, be they people, birds, or the reddish stones at the old cemetery. Anatolia grasped that there was no heaven and no hell. Happiness was heaven and grief was hell. And their God was everywhere, all over, not just because he was all powerful, but also because of the unseen threads that connected them with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lisa, can I just interrupt, because as you were reading, which is actually one of my favorite places in that book, and it reminded me of how the book starts. And so I picked up my copy, which I have by my side here, which is it's really one of my favorite books I've read recently. And here's the first line, first 3 lines of the book. The same character, Anatolia. It's set in the Armenian mountains, by the way, in an old mountain village. Okay. On Friday, just past noon, after the sun had rolled past its lofty zenith and begun sliding sedately toward the western edge of the valley, Anatolia Sivayans lay down to breathe her last. And she prepares everything for her death, for people to come and find the clothes that she's to be buried in and so on, right? That's the beginning of the novel. So it starts pretty dark. And then, well, you just have to read the book. But it reminds me also of many other dark books I've read. And weirdly, the darkest books I've read are not Russian. Maybe it's because I have an immunity, if we're allowed to use, illness metaphors. I've read so much dark Russian literature that it actually feels really happy to me most of the time. But for example, if you read The Road by Cormac McCarthy, I don't know if anyone's read that. I was on the Duke Summer Reading Committee. I chaired that committee a couple of years. And that book was nominated. It's one of the darkest things you're ever going to read. It's about apocalypse. It's, you know, the world has gone up in some kind of horrible cataclysm. You know, the landscape is burned and there's only two people alive, the man and his son. And the whole book is them just walking through this devastated landscape. And it was nominated for Duke summer reading. You know, it's like, and there were some people, you know, from the Duke Psychological Counseling Office there who said, we cannot have them read this book. But, you know, if they made it to the end, the book is so dark. And I noticed a couple of people smiled when I mentioned the title. So you've read the book. You get to the end, that last little paragraph. Well, I'm not going to give anything away, but it redeems everything. And you feel this incredible joy when you read the book, you know, but of course you have to get through it. And also, you know, for reading dark literature, you don't always, the author isn't always the one who's going to give you the answer at the end either. You know, you might be sort of stuck in the darkness. You have to claw your way out of it somehow. But I think that's good for you. You know, it's healthy to claw your way out of darkness. I don't know if that's, you know, that people really need to plunge into really dark things just to be healthy people. I'm not sure that's a very healthy way of looking at the world either. But yeah.
But isn't that part of, I mean, for me anyway, that's part of the, you know, the consoling, we'll use the air quotes, right? Part of what I find almost consoling, because there you are, you don't, you know, you're trying to figure it out, and then you figure it out for yourself. You claw your way out.
Yeah, in a safe space. You know what I mean? In a safe space. It's not real, but it's close enough. I mean, that's what good writers do, is they create an entire world for you that is real, that's real enough. That you actually do get to do that real work in yourself too. And also understand people around you more, which I think is really, really important. Again, this morning in the Morrison Shapiro's talk, it was like, we are so divided, at least in the United States, you know, and probably around the world, in encampments of people who just don't understand each other. You know, something has to break down those boundaries between completely different camps of people who just refuse to listen to each other. And neither side is not guilty, if that makes sense, right? So that literature can teach you how to sort of break down, maybe nibble away at some of those boundaries without actually having to like smile at your enemy, you know, in real life, you know, sort of learn how to appreciate the person somehow. So I was thinking about, you know, reading in confinement. Peter, you got to keep riding herd on us, okay? Make sure we're balanced out appropriately. But I thought, as I think about how we're all trapped in here, and everybody who I see these wonderful names up on our screen here, who are listening in, and being part of the conversation, yet all of us are like, we're confined, you know, we're trapped in our space, whatever that space might be. And so that idea of being trapped because of the pandemic is a very sort of powerful thing. It's real, but it's also a metaphor for many things as well. Being trapped in a bad job, you know, or being trapped in a bad whatever family situation, or being trapped in prison. All of these are forms of confinement, and being trapped in your body, which is a prison too. Your soul is trapped in your body. So literature is very powerful in enabling us to think through the ways that we're trapped in the world. I think about this a lot. You know, Russia has a very highly developed literature of prison life. You know, it's about as good as it gets. And so I was thinking about this, and I know a couple of my students seem to be here, which is so exciting. I can hardly even express in words how exciting that is, but maybe they've heard this story. At one point in the Dostoyevsky Society, we made Dostoyevsky Magnets, and I'll hold one up. This is the second edition, but we have the first one that was a magnet made on the basis of notes from underground. And so we were sending these magnets around, and I went down to the UPS office with this very heavy, they're very heavy, sorry if you didn't see this, but they're very heavy, these magnets, really tiny box. It was super heavy. And the guy behind the counter said, like, what's in that box? I said, well, you know, it's Dostoyevsky Magnets, as though that were a thing. You know, it's not like saying, well, this is, you know, a book I'm sending. No, they're Dostoyevsky Magnets. He goes, really? Dostoyevsky Magnets? I go, yeah. He goes, wow. He said, I love Dostoyevsky. And there was no one else in the store. And so we started talking about Dostoyevsky. We had this great conversation. There was no one there. And sort of like the whole universe went away, and it didn't matter what century we were in. We were just having a conversation. He goes, yeah, he said, there was a time in my life when me and my friends just talked, we read Dostoyevsky all the time. We talked about Dostoyevsky and nothing else. I go, really? When was that? He goes, well, we were locked up in prison and that's all we had to do. There was no TV, there's no internet, our phone calls were limited. And we just sat there and read these Dostoyevsky books and talked about them. And that has stayed with me all this time, you know, that no matter where you are, somehow literature can be a consolation, can feel real actually, even though, you know, it doesn't look real from the outside.
That sounds like a UPS store version of No Exit when you're in prison and all you can do is talk about Dostoyevsky.
It could be worse. It could be worse, you know.
Oh, it could be a lot worse.
Yeah.
No, that makes me think about the book, the one we were talking about, when he's in camp, which now I can't think of the title of. I'm terrible with titles.
What we were talking about? The Russian.
With Christmas, when he's in the camp.
Oh, Notes from the House of the Dead. Yeah, it's one of the House of the Dead.
Thank you. Yeah.
I can bring it out here.
But speaking of feeling trapped, first of all, in terms of reading habits, I find that now I'm even less patient than I usually am if I'm not liking a book and I'm feeling trapped. I just toss them aside. I mean, literally, I went through a stack of books before I got to Pure, and then Turgenev back in the beginning of the pandemic. It was terrible. They were just sort of going left and right, you know, can't read this, can't read that. But there's also, this was a book, I blogged about this one, Belayev's Professor Dowell's Head. And this one really hit me during the summer. Annie, I can see you nodding. Have you read it? Because it's where a guy's head, like on the cover, is being kept in a lab. And actually there's more than one head in the lab. And reading this during the summer of a pandemic, you know, where people are just staying at home and you're not supposed to be interacting, and where everything feels like a science fiction novel anyway, because you don't know who's going to get hit hard. You don't know who's, you know, if somebody has the virus, they might not show any symptoms. And why does that happen? And why does anything happen? So reading this was the perfect thing because it was all about sort of the mind-body connection, and are you still a human being if you're just a lab being kept, if you're just a head being kept in a lab on its own. And I was like, well, you know, here we are just sitting at home and we're still people, even though we're not going out to the grocery store all the time like we used to, or, you know, I can't go for coffee now, but it was kind of a nice, it's a really easy book to read. It just, you know, it's a page turner, not always well structured, but it was good.
But it was one that you could stick with. Yeah. One that you could stick with.
I could stick with it. Yeah. I've really found that it's been the odd books that I've been able to stick with the best. You know, the one Pромezhutok Intervals, which Mirren, I think she's on, Mirren McGuire, has translated it to English, and I hope somebody will pick it up. You know, there's a piece of bread that's thinking and making observations. And also Ksenia Buksha's Churav and Churban, which I know Annie has translated some excerpts from. It's also kind of it's sort of like the dark realism, but with twists of magical realism kind of thrown into it. And it's a book, and I'm really hoping it wins the Big Book Award tomorrow. But,
how exciting.
I know.
I was just thinking as you were telling us about the first book and then the others too, that there's really no way for me to know for sure that the people I'm seeing on the screen right now are any more than heads, the ones that I see, you know. It's really not that far from reality sometimes, particularly people who live doing what we do, which is, you know, live reading books, thinking about things. And then there's a little channel of energy that comes from our brain through our hands, you know, and then we type on the computer and then something comes out and it's a book. But the rest of us, you know, really is not visible here on the screen for anyone. I don't mean to be too precious about it, but it does remind us that, you know, when our bodies are confined, our brains can also give some escape. Maybe that's put a little bit more primitively, but in a sense, that's what we do when we read anyway. You know, you take yourself out of your full physical existence. And really, unless you're reading out loud to people, which I think is really a nice thing to do, most of the time you have to be by yourself to appreciate somebody else, whether that person. And what I love about it is that these people, you know, they're dead, or you know, the dead writers, and yet they're communicating with me. And Chekhov, you know, before he died, it was in the 90s, and he was very sick, and he knew he was going to die, and he told someone, he goes, you know, no one's going to read me 7 years after I die. No one's, it's just quote. And like, here we are, you know, he died in 1904. So it's over 100 years later. We've just passed 107 years, and we still read him, and more people read him, and read them because there are translators translating these works into yet newer and newer languages. There's something really, really very beautiful and life affirming about the fact that some guy, or in the case of, you know, Chekhov, Dostoyevsky, and Tolstoy, these are men, you know, and they're sitting in a lonely room, or in the lucky case of Dostoyevsky, he was actually dictating to his wife. So there were two people there, and there was some talking going on. But for the most part, you know, they had to be by themselves in total isolation to write these books. And I'm in isolation reading them. And there's something very validating and wonderful about the communication that I have with this dead person. It's kind of like that fantastic realism in the books that we're talking about, where, you know, there's a splash of blue light that comes down the mountainside, and that's it, you know, and somehow that is someone's soul or guardian angel, and then it disappears, and we go on with our lives. It's kind of life affirming, even if someone totally made it up, which is okay sometimes. Yeah, there's much more to be said about that, I think.
There is, yeah, and I think Ilona, who's on here, she and I had messaged, I always call it, a little bit earlier today, and I told her that I always feel, I think it was her that I was writing to, I said that I always feel wistful when I see all these pictures on, you know, these little squares on the screen. And then when everybody at the end of it, and Sarah, I think, had mentioned this on Twitter, not liking to be the last one to click off, you know, to actually see it all go away. I like to try to not be the last one too, because it's just so sad when it's the last one, and when you're seeing all your beloved colleagues that you can't meet with in person. It's just, I don't know, it's a bittersweet thing. You know, I'm very grateful that we can do this. I'm very grateful that the Institute was able to hold our Translators Congress earlier in the year, but oh, it's so sad. It's so happy but sad to click off these screens at the end. It's a very different feel.
I know, but we could flip it around, Lisa. We flip it around, like we're together, like you and I are. I don't want to get too schmaltzy here, but I mean, you know, we're together, and we got a lot of people with us here today who would not be here otherwise, and probably.
I know, that's what I'm saying. It's great.
Yeah, it's actually pretty good. It's the glass is half full, actually, believe it or not. Yeah.
Even more.
Yeah, so you see. So I don't know if I think we solved some problem, Lisa. I think we've actually answered one of those русские вопросы, those cursed questions that are never supposed to be answered. But maybe we didn't talk enough about escapism somehow. Maybe it's because I was thinking about Tolstoy, and the idea. Okay, so here's a thought for us. I lived pretty much in the 19th century, despite the fact that I can go to the supermarket and I actually can drive around, you know, and do things that people do in the 21st century. But mostly, you know, my life is spent. I was thinking again about Chekhov, who went to Rome, and he writes in a letter to someone. He goes, "Oh, it's so loud in Rome." He's got this hotel that's on the street. He goes, "It's so loud. There are these horse hoofs clattering by my window at all hours of the night." And I'm like, not semi-trucks, not sirens, you know, not street noise, not motors, not the leaf blower, not the damn leaf blower. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing this, but horse hoofs clopping. And, you know, if you go back in the 19th century or to the world of Laurus, where they don't even have pavement or whatever, you're in a completely different universe. And so we started out by talking about masterpieces, and your books that you translate are more from the 21st century for the most part, right?
Yeah.
New Russian literature, even though some of them are set in previous times, or they offer glimpses into timeless worlds, right?
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if you think maybe that the worlds that we inhabit are different in some fundamental way. I don't mean the worlds that you and I inhabit, because we're sort of pretty close to each other, but the worlds depicted in these books.
I'm sorry. So you're wondering if
If
I want to
there,
understand your question.
yeah, like, so we started talking about masterpieces, and it's easy enough for me to say, well, Tolstoy is he writes masterpieces, or Chekhov. But as you get into modern literature, some of these books are masterpieces. I think Laurus is. I think we sort of agree on that. But there's an awful lot of other stuff that we read. And do the books that we read represent some kind of fundamentally changed reality as time goes on? Maybe that's something I'm trying to ask. Is there something qualitatively different about reading Tolstoy from reading a book, any book, that addresses contemporary reality? Does it feel more superficial, for example?
No.
Mm.
Well, yes and no. I don't, for me, there's, how do I put this? I don't want classics the same as I read contemporary books, but I'm still looking for the same qualities. I'm still looking for something that holds my interest. I'm looking for a book that holds together structurally. I'm still looking for that same, what I call the internal logic of the text, where every piece of the book has its own function, and where every piece of where everything meshes together to form something that really truly is art composed of words. So from that angle, I would have to say no. It's all the same for me.
I do want to jump in as an immodest moderator and just say we have a cavalcade of extraordinary comments in the chat going on, many of which are just pure praise for this event today. But the first, or earlier on, from Catherine Young, is a question about the canon and women writers. If you see it there, perhaps you could embody it for a moment in your response, so that anyone who is not reading the chat can hear the question. But yeah, it's addressed to you both, I think.
It's such a great question, right? It's such a great question. I can just sort of start with a couple of thoughts. I could say that I'm guilty, because the books that I teach are written by Tolstoy, Dostoyevsky, Chekhov, and they're sort of taught because they're classics, and also because they're good. And there are other books out there written at the same time that might not have even gotten published, or I think about the model, for example, of the Good Wife, if I can put it that way, Anna Grigorievna Dostoyevskaya, who basically lived her life totally serving her husband in every single minute of his life. She wrote down every word he wrote. She was his secretary, basically a stenographer. And so it's sort of become, with women in that era, it's a very different type of model, I guess. If there was another War and Peace or another great classic work of literature written by a woman at that time, it might have gotten sort of used for kindling, you know what I mean? Rolled up and put in the stove. Certainly not published or something. So there's an awful lot that's written that we never ever have access to. And there are political forces involved, and gender biases and other kinds of biases at work. But I've noticed, the books that I love the most of recent and modern literature, so just great women writers, just unbelievable literature written in the 20th and 21st century by women. Again, mostly Russian women, because that's what I read mostly. So I don't know if that's changing over time. I mean, it's such a great question. What do you think, Lisa?
I don't know. I mean, this is, if I look at the books, the ones that have pleased me over the summer, I'm left with Buksha and I'm left with Kuznetsova. And and also I don't have it on paper in a print version, but there's a new Vodolazkin novel out that I liked as well. And I'm now reading Yakhina's new novel, which is not out yet. I don't know. I think right now I think it's probably too early to say, because we don't know if Vodolazkin, Sorokin, Pilev, we don't know who from now will still be read in another 50 years, let alone another 100, and what will there still be something considered a canon at that time? I don't know. I don't even know about that. But to me, the question of all the things that Kate mentions, and these are things that trouble me a lot too, are works by women judged by the same standards as, say, a work by Vodolazkin. That's what really kind of gets to me. And what you say, Carol, about works that we don't know about is very true, because not every good book is nominated for an award, right, for a broad number of readers to know about, or to sell well. Not everyone trusts the awards. Not everyone trusts the publishers. I hear a lot about trust issues in Russian literature. I don't know. I mean, to me, Kuznetsova's book was a whole lot more interesting than at least half of this year's big book shortlist. I thought it was pretty much a terrible list this year. I thought it was really hard to read a lot of the books because they felt too derivative. They felt just dull, not well structured, not well, yeah. There were some ones, yeah, there were, but a lot of them just were unreadable to me, and I've heard some similar comments from others.
Yeah, super. So many forces at work that are sort of invisible, behind the scenes, commerce, and agents at work and whatnot. But the question also reminded me of something that really kind of exposed that whole sort of set of factors, and that is actually Alisa Ganieva's debut novel. It's a novella, which I have here somewhere, but I'm not going to jump up and try and find it, but I'll show you, her more recent book, just so you know who she is. Alisa Ganieva, whom I translate. I'm working on her third novel now. She made her literary debut by winning the debut prize, the Russian debut fiction prize. And what she did was she created an anonymous text, it's a short novella, in the voice of a very rough Dagestani youth, sort of uneducated youth, with lots and lots of slang and very heavily marked male language, and it was anonymous. And she submitted this to the debut prize, and the jury was very much these they're not macho, right, because they're Russian, but for example, Prilyapin was on the jury, and the people who were just like military veterans from the Chechen War, they were part of this jury, and they selected the book as the winner of the prize, that they did not know that it was written by a woman. And it was this huge shock that they that she worked on them when this book was, they just couldn't even believe that it was written by a woman. And she would not have won the prize if they had known that,
Well, including Prilyapin didn't he even call it very masculine prose or something like that, or muscular prose, something like that? Yeah, and there was
a critic was, quote, a female critic said, "Oh yeah, I know a man's writing when I see it." It was just a delicious debut, delicious joke. Kind of really, it's a wonderful story, and it's kind of like Dostoyevsky's magnificent debut, and other writers in history who've just burst on the scene with their first books, So it's an important question, very interesting, and I mean, certainly the issues are different now in the 21st century than they were in the 19th century, right? They're maybe not qualitatively different, maybe people still don't want to read. I think there's also this empathy thing, right? People like to read books by people like themselves. It's just, I like to read books by someone who might be more, closer to my experience. That's just human, regardless of who you are. I hope that makes sense, right? So German Sadullayev, who I see on the program, is it tomorrow, Peter, is going to be talking. He's also someone I translated his book, which is very masculine voice. And it was difficult for me to translate because I found myself inhabiting this mind of someone whom I probably, the character, I've, of course, Sadullayev is different, but the character, I was like, I would never invite the guy over, to talk to him. It's like, I would not want to like have this guy be my friend because he's so different, And so for me as a translator, it was really a great exercise in empathy and trying to understand where this voice comes from, particularly misogyny, which we're very sensitive to in the West, but maybe less so among some of our Russian colleagues. It's a culturally rooted thing sometimes.
Here's another question from the chat, also from Annie, and seconded even by another participant here, which is there any kind of subject matter? And I'm mindful of the fact that we have a few minutes left as your sort of timekeeper. Is there any kind of subject matter you're not seeing as much of, or should there be more of it in contemporary Russian fiction?
Oh, you're looking at me?
We're looking at you.
Well, you know what? Steve Pinhorn, do you mind if I ask your question? It came to me directly. Steve, go ahead. Because there's a question that Steve sent, it just came to me privately, so I'll go ahead and ask it. And what I'll do is I'll relate this question to an answer for what I'm seeing. The question is, both you and Carol agree that Laurus is a masterpiece, and he put a capital M for that, yes. Could you say why, apart from its darkness, does it come close to AK, which I'm taking to be Anna Karenina, or CNP, which I'm taking as Crime and Punishment? I would say the reasons for me that it's a masterpiece are that despite it being dark and despite it being so very, very Russian and so specifically Russian, the medieval theme, it's one of the most universal books that I think I've ever read. It's one of the books that appeals to humanity and love and the element of time and the element of I don't know, of continuation of life and faith, whether you're religious or not. I'm not religious, and this book is taken by many. I've noticed a lot of comments online where people have said this is the most orthodox book that I've ever read, and I'm thinking, whoa, to me, you don't need to be religious to really appreciate this book on many, many, many levels. And I think rather than saying, Annie, I'm sorry, I don't know if I can come up with what I would like to see in specifics, but what I would like to see is more work that is both very Russian, like this book is, but so universal. I mean, this book has been translated into dozens of languages. People are rereading it in translation, which just absolutely floors me. I mean, it only came out, what, 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and people are rereading it. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for books that have that level of kindness, I guess, in a way. People used to talk about dobrые книги in Russia when I was living there. This is a dobrая книга. Yes, it's got darkness, but it's also got kindness. I'm not even really sure what to do with dobrая in this context. Kindness, goodness, niceness, positive things. It's almost more like positive, which came into fashion just in the last 5 years, I guess. That's what I'd like to see more of. Seriousness, yes, with all the darkness. There's plague, there's death, there's the end of, end of the world, but also good things, life and life-giving power and good things coming out of it all.
Yeah,
that's what I want.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lisa, and I'd throw in a couple other things too, and that is, first of all, we live in the land of Russian language, and the work is just such a beautiful linguistic texture, and so is the translation, by the way, just beautiful in that regard. It's also not superficial, there can be sort of nice books, but it's a book about a man who did a terrible thing, you know, and has spent the rest of his life atoning for it and suffering and putting himself, you know, through that need to atone for the terrible thing that he did. And that's very Russian in a way, you know, but that's one of the things that makes Russian literature so powerful, I think, is that focus on really, really the most important ethical things, you know, in this clothing of a dobraya kniga, you know, a kind book or a positive book, a book that's positive, nurturing maybe, right? Not harm,
nurture.
you know, do no harm, first of all. So I'm terrified. It's 3 o'clock, Peter.
It is. I know. I'm aware of that. We should probably wrap up. I have to say though that I love the, you know, one theme that was you began to unfurl at early on in today's hour, which is the concept that readers of Russian literature might develop some kind of immunity to these dark times that we're in. And I just love that. Like, what would the data look like? Like, how do you test for that? How do you know whether you've achieved a certain level of immunity? Do you have to go repeatedly for more Russian literature, like shots? Like, yeah, this hour has been brought to us clearly not only by the Institute of Translation in Moscow and Read Russia, but also by the Holy Donut in Scarborough, Maine. I want to ask if you'd like to wrap up with a thought or two. We can extend ourselves a little bit before maybe Zoom throws us off, but clearly people are staying. And perhaps one last word from each of you. You each have 95 seconds. No, no, whatever. What, serious?
Yeah, I'm happy to keep talking. I'm having a good time as well. I love the point you made earlier at the other session, Peter, that, you know, with medicine that people get, that big fold out thing that you get with your prescription, that there could be some, you know, a prescription for a Chekhov story, for example, or perhaps even a whole story, you know, provided that you can sort of have together with your medicine, because literature can be healing. I don't mean to sort of make this seem superficial, you know, that we could read literature and we'll all feel better. I would say, you know, the thing about a masterpiece, I know, Lisa, you talked about how the book is put together, the language is well done, you know, but there's also this thing, there's a spirit that dominates the whole book, right? But there's also this thing in Russian literature where the really great books are messy, you know, they don't fit. Like War and Peace, it's like crazy. There's this stuff about history in the middle of it, you know, it drives people nuts, but the book wouldn't really work so well without it, you know. They're messy. The Demons by Dostoyevsky, which has come up today, a messy book, you know, just really punks out in every direction, you know, and there's like, is it a comedy and is it a tragedy? That, you know, there's an awful lot of great books in the Russian tradition, which is pretty much where I live, that just don't follow the rules. Gogol's Dead Souls is another example, you know. And furthermore, there's all these great Russian classics that were actually meant to be like trilogies, and the author wound up burning the second part, you know, as in the case of the Gogol's Dead Souls, or Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, which is supposed to go on for 3 more volumes, you know, but didn't, and somehow it's like a perfect whole by itself. So I don't know if there's some imperfection that we can find in some of these great books that makes them even more masterpieces.
Well, yeah, I mean, if the book's internal logic is strong enough, it can handle all those messy things. And that's why War and Peace wouldn't be the same without those boring but necessary essays on history in the middle. And I mean, Laurus, a lot of people didn't understand, is a spoiler okay? I don't know if everybody's read it or not. The plastic stuff. I mean, a lot of Russian readers didn't get it. They just absolutely didn't get it. And they were, and one friend of mine, a history teacher, she was saying, what is this guy's problem? He can't write at all. I mean, he knows nothing about the Middle Ages. She obviously didn't know that he's a medievalist. And so it didn't work for everybody because they found it too messy. But I thought, I mean, for me, it's a neat book because he's able to make the book work to hold in those messy things and to make them work.
Yeah.
But I guess if there's, Peter, you were looking for sort of closing notes. Was that?
Yes, and I have to exert just the cruelest, scepter in a moment. I have to, yeah, but please, closing notes.
I just, I think the main thing that I'm coming out of, well, who knows when we're all coming out of this pandemic as readers and as human beings. But I think one of the things that I've really learned from it is slowing down as a reader. And one of the things that has helped me with that has been reading Proust. I joined up with a Twitter group that is reading Proust about 10 to 12 pages a day. And I can't say that I'm the best reader of Proust. I'm probably among the worst readers of Proust, but I love the routine to it. And I love having to slow down as I read those pages every day. And that's something that I've kind of taken with me to my other reading as well. Yeah. It doesn't mean that I'm more patient with the books that I don't like, but it means that I'm slowing down to take everything in better than I used to. And it's the same when I look out the window. I pay more attention to the birds. I pay more attention to the clouds. I pay more attention to all the little things that I have. And I know that sounds cliched and cheesy, but that's where we are.
It does. It comes right from the heart. And Carol, if you do have students in this hour, they must be the luckiest students in the world to have you as a teacher.
Keep talking, Peter. Keep talking. I see.
I like. Yeah. But maybe you can give us the last word.
Well, maybe it's Lisa started it, and I typed it in the chat because I was worried we wouldn't get to talk about it. This idea of slow reading and focusing. What's really, I mean, again, nobody wants to have the plague come upon us, and whatever else is going on in the world, which is sort of horrible. But I was really not even sort of, I tell my students not to use adverbs, and I'm using one and just totally undermine what I'm saying. Things are horrible out there. But one of the things I think we do learn by being stuck inside with our books is that one of the reasons we don't read slowly is because a lot of the things that we're reading or watching are not worth it. The stuff that we see on TV or whatever you see on the internet or the Twitter and whatnot. I mean, it just doesn't nurture us. It doesn't nurture our soul. And it reminds me of this movement, which I never really grew into anything. It used to be called slow food. Did you guys remember this? Sure. Slow food, like you just eat slowly. And it was a whole movement. I'm going, yeah, of course, if it's good food, you're going to eat it slowly. But if it's crappy, horrible food, you're not going to want to eat it slowly. Well, the same thing goes for good reading, with Tolstoy in particular. I don't want to betray Chekhov, who is my first love or second love at this point after Dostoyevsky, but Tolstoy is someone that, the slower you go, the better it is. Of being in that world with him. Every single sentence shows you more about that world. It's worth spending time there, and then you get to the end, and I love that some of my students said this time, it's like, you get to the end of it, it's 1,300 pages, and they're like, oh no, it's over, we have to leave it behind. Nothing's stopping you from opening it up again, starting with page 1. And reading it even slower,
I'm just going to say that this, if you'll allow me to close, and over the protests of so many people in our chat is like the equivalent of, concerts. If you remember those, you'd go and, at the end, like everybody would be holding their lighter up and waiting for the band to just keep playing, come out again. I think what the message is that I'm picking up from this is, we need to do these more often. If we can sponsor some events and not just wait till December every year. It seems like the pandemic, it might be super useful. So I hope that after we rest a little bit after this week, we can reconnect and figure out ways to bring more of these discussions to folks online during these tough winter months when we're all kind of isolated and reading works that have been written by people and been alone. That's an incredible connection. Mm-hmm. Can I try to represent the group and just express our gratitude again collectively for your Carol, Lisa, for your for all of your work, and in particular for spending the time with us today.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to see everybody too, or at least the things that look like there are people behind them. Oh, you know,
And sorry.
oh, Lisa, you set us up. You said,
Verbal cues.
yeah, you're saying
What?
someone's got to be last. So we're all waiting.
I know. Well, it's the verbal cues that I miss, or the nonverbal cues on Zoom. You know, I don't see you well enough, Carol, to know that you weren't finished. But really, thanks really go to Peter for doing this, for organizing this, and for contacting me, what, a month or two about doing something. And I was saying,
More
let's
of
do
these,
something
like
about constellation.
Yeah.
What?
More of these, like Carol was doing. Yeah. When I was praising her teaching. Yeah.
But it was Peter's initial message, and then our initial phone call where I said, yeah, let's do something about constellation. And then I was just kind of thinking, oh, what are we going to do? And he said, how about that Carol Apollonio? Or so, I don't, he didn't put it quite like that, but he suggested doing something with Carol, which I was thumbs up for, even if it's not at the Holy Donut.
Next.
Well, next time, bring your laptops over there if they let you in. And
That's a good idea, actually.
Yeah, and you know, maybe they could use the plug. Who knows? Maybe
Well, they have lines.
This has been serious plugging for the Holy Donut, and I think we need to forward this to them. And I think Lisa needs a lifetime supply of free donuts, which she will share with me and the rest of us, I hope.
We'll let them know. So it was said. Thank you everybody for joining, and remember, Russian Literature Week continues. Every day is Russian Literature Week, but this week we have a bunch of more things going on. Thank you both. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Peter. Bye. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's great to see you.
Yes.
Bye.
Yeah, Lisa and I, we're gonna, Lisa's gone. She was talking.
You're still, no, I'm not. I'm still here.
I thought you left.
I'm gonna cut us off, though.
Yeah,
Peter.
All right.
My job. See you. Bye.
Sorry, we have to hurry.
All right.